Tonight, we uncover one of the darkest whispers ever tied to the walls of the Vatican, a secret so buried in archives and sealed behind silence that even mentioning it once risked exile from the Church's grace. They say when the war ended in 1945, the world sought justice, but not everyone faced it, because somewhere between faith and forgiveness, escape routes opened. Routes that led not to salvation, but to South America, to freedom, to new lives for men who should have faced the gallows. There are those who believe the Vatican played a part in this escape, that, under the veil of mercy and charity, it helped some of history's most dangerous men vanish into the world's shadows. But how could that be? How could the centre of Christendom become the crossroads of secrecy? The answer lies not in open confession, but in corridors, ledgers, and letters written in ink that still refuses to fade. They called them rat lines. Pathways stretching from the ruins of Austria, through the monasteries of Italy, down to ports in Genoa and Trieste. On paper, they were refugee networks, helping the lost find safety. But mixed among the desperate and displaced were officers, commanders, and ideologues of the Third Reich, moving under new names, carrying Red Cross documents stamped with quiet blessings from men of the cloth. Each stamp a prayer, each signature a passage, and at the centre of it all stood questions no archive could silence. Was it compassion, politics, or something far more deliberate? How did the same institution that preached redemption become the unseen hand guiding fugitives past Allied lines? Declassified files hint at coordination. Letters marked with the Vatican's seal refer to souls in need of care. Ships leaving Genoa carried passengers who no longer existed in the eyes of justice. In Buenos Aires, new lives began for men whose crimes were written in blood. And through it all, the Vatican remained silent, neutral, as it claimed, merciful, as it insisted. But silence can be a language of its own, one spoken by those who know more than they can confess. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Because tonight, we are not just revisiting history, we are walking into the spaces where history was rewritten, where holiness and horror met behind closed doors, where charity became a mask for escape, and where the truth, even now, still hides in the marble of the Vatican itself. Could the church that defined morality have helped those who defied it? Or is that exactly what we were meant to believe, so that the truth could remain forever cloaked in faith? Tonight, we trace the rat lines, and what we find may change the way you see both history and redemption. The night is quiet in Vatican City, too quiet for a place that has seen so much history. Beneath the glow of old lanterns, marble walls hold their breath. They've listened for centuries to whispers, prayers, and confessions, but some secrets are heavier than sin. There are rumours that in the years after the Second World War, men in black uniforms slipped through the shadows of these same streets, men who should have been facing trial, men the world called war criminals. Yet somehow they vanished. Some say they were helped, not by soldiers, not by spies, but by the church itself. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica, corridors run deeper than most imagine. Old records speak of storerooms, sealed offices, and doors that haven't been opened since the 1940s. Each door bears a symbol, a crest, a date. But behind the marble calm, something feels uneasy, as if history itself is trying to whisper back. Could it be true? Did the Vatican, the heart of the Catholic world, help members of the defeated Nazi regime escape justice after the war? It sounds impossible, but history is full of impossibilities that turned out to be true. When the war ended in 1945, Europe was in ruins, borders were broken, governments shattered, millions were displaced, and in the chaos, paper became more valuable than gold. A passport, a letter of recommendation, a signature with the church's seal, these could erase the past. They could turn a wanted man into a refugee, they could make a monster into a pilgrim. Deep within the Vatican, a network of priests, diplomats, and missionaries was already working to move thousands of war-torn refugees through Italy. But mixed among the innocent were others, men with blood on their hands, slipping through the same channels. The Allies called them fugitives. The Church called them souls in need of salvation. Somewhere between those words lies a truth the archives still won't give up. The marble corridors of the Apostolic Palace echo with every footstep, like ghosts pacing between centuries. Each echo asks the same question: were these men saved from vengeance, or were they being hidden from justice? The Vatican has always claimed it was only helping the lost, the poor, the faithful. But the names found in old ledgers tell a darker story. German, Croatian, Austrian. Names once printed on arrest warrants and war crime lists. They vanish from history after 1946. Reappearing years later in Argentina, Chile, Brazil, the trail begins here under the watchful eyes of saints carved in stone, a city built on faith, now shadowed by suspicion. The Vatican's silence only feeds the mystery. Why protect men who destroyed millions of lives? Was it politics, pity, or something even more secret? The marble doesn't answer, but it remembers. It remembers the footsteps of priests who carried sealed envelopes, the sound of whispered German prayers behind closed doors, the faint echo of ships leaving Genoa, carrying ghosts who would never face their crimes. Tonight, the question still stands like a locked gate. Did the Vatican save their souls, or simply hide their sins? The word sounds harmless at first, ratlines. But in the years after the Second World War, that single word carried the weight of 1,000 hidden lives. It was the name whispered by soldiers on the run, by priests guarding secrets, and by investigators who always arrived too late. Ratlines were escape routes, secret trails that wound like veins through a shattered Europe, leading from the mountains of Austria and Bavaria to the warm, waiting ports of Italy. Through them, hundreds of Nazi officers and collaborators slipped out of sight and into new lives. No one knows exactly who built the first ratline, but by the late 1940s, the paths were well worn. They began in small villages near Salzburg and Innsbruck, where fugitives hid among refugees flooding south. From there, they moved through the Alps, across narrow mountain passes into northern Italy. Each step of the journey was helped by someone who knew not to ask questions. A farmer who lent his barn for a night. A nun who handed over food and silence. A monk who stamped a baptismal certificate with a new name. On maps, these routes barely existed, but in the real world, they formed a web of safe houses, monasteries, and secret hostels that stretched all the way to Genoa and Rome. At the end of those roads waited new identities, false papers, fresh passports, and for many, a ship bound for South America. The ratlines had their own language, their own code. A forged Red Cross document was called a travel blessing. A letter of protection, signed by a priest, could make an accused war criminal a refugee overnight. The Vatican said it was simply helping those lost in the chaos, but among the thousands of refugees were men with names the world would never forget. The ratlines turned guilt into a ghost. Every town along the way has its own story. In the monasteries of Rome, witnesses remember men arriving at night, pale, silent, dressed as pilgrims. They prayed with rosaries in their hands and fear in their eyes. Some were given shelter, others were given directions. The routes changed constantly, twisting to avoid Allied patrols. Sometimes they moved through Trieste, other times through Bolzano. When one path closed, another opened. It was like chasing smoke. By 1948, investigators in London and Washington had begun to suspect the truth. They intercepted letters, watched ships leaving the ports of Genoa and Naples, and tracked familiar faces boarding under unfamiliar names. But by the time the authorities caught up, the fugitives were gone. South America, the Middle East, even Canada. the rat lines worked too well. They were more than roads. They were systems, built out of faith, fear, and paperwork. And somewhere in the centre of it all, just beyond the reach of proof, stood the church. Some said it turned a blind eye. Others believed it held the key. The word rat lines still whispers through the archives, soft as prayer, dangerous as truth. After the war ended in 1945, Europe was a graveyard with borders. Cities were broken, records destroyed, and millions of people wandered roads that no longer led home. Soldiers without countries, refugees without names. In that chaos, a single piece of paper could mean the difference between freedom and prison. A passport was more than a document. It was a disguise, a rebirth, a second life for those who had lost everything or wanted to hide what they had done. Allied officials worked day and night to rebuild identity systems. But the lines between refugee, victim, and fugitive blurred quickly. The Red Cross, overwhelmed by desperation, began issuing travel documents known as displaced person cards. They were meant to help innocent survivors of war start new lives abroad. Yet in the confusion, the process became easy to exploit. Men who had served in the darkest parts of the Nazi machine learned how to blend in. They shaved their heads, grew beards, changed accents. They claimed to be labourers, farmers, or technicians, just another face in the tide of humanity moving south. One signature, one church stamp, and their past disappeared. The Vatican's charity networks were also flooded with requests for aid. Priests and missionaries handed out letters of recommendation, often without knowing, or without wanting to know, who was really receiving them. A letter printed on Vatican paper carried weight. It could open borders that were closed to everyone else, add a Red Cross pass, and a man could travel from Munich to Milan without a single question asked. Somewhere along the way, the idea of mercy became tangled with convenience. In dusty offices and candle-lit churches, new names were written on old forms. Baptismal certificates were forged to prove new faiths or old ones reborn. Joseph became Giovanni. Carl became Carlos. The paper made it real. The Allies soon realized that criminals were escaping through the cracks, but the cracks were too wide to seal. Every camp held thousands waiting for permission to leave Europe. Inspectors could barely keep up. By the time they learned a name was false, the person was gone, already on a ship bound for Argentina, Chile, or Egypt. Some priests claimed they were saving souls, not aiding fugitives. Others said they had no choice, that denying help could mean condemning someone innocent. But innocence was easy to fake when the proof was only ink. The power of paper turned truth into a matter of design. It wasn't guns or money that moved these men across continents. It was stamps, signatures, and the faith of those who believed the documents in front of them. The passport that wasn't real became more powerful than the one that was. And as Europe tried to heal, the ghosts of war walked freely among the living, dressed in new names, carrying papers that gleamed with false holiness. In the heart of Rome, not far from the Vatican walls, there once lived a bishop whose name still stirs quiet arguments among historians. He was known for his sharp mind, his perfect German, and his deep devotion to helping displaced souls after the war. His office was a maze of papers, maps, and handwritten notes, all bound together in one worn leather ledger. To the casual eye, it looked like a record of charity, lists of names, places, and dates. But in the margins, written in careful Latin, were strange symbols, initials, and words that didn't belong in the vocabulary of mercy. The bishop claimed to be providing spiritual care to refugees, yet the routes his letters described all led in the same direction: south, Argentina, Chile, Paraguay. The pages told a story not of salvation, but of escape. Investigators would later say this bishop had become one of the key figures in organizing safe passage for high-ranking Nazis after 1945. He called them pilgrims. Others called them fugitives. He wrote letters of recommendation to Red Cross officials, to embassies, even to ship captains. The documents bore the Vatican's seal, giving them a holiness that shielded them from suspicion. Each letter was short, polite, and deliberately vague. This man is of good moral standing and requires assistance in travelling abroad. A single sentence could erase a lifetime of crimes. The bishop's ledger became his shadow gospel. On one side, verses from scripture. On the other, directions through the ratlines that crisscrossed Europe. Inns near Genoa, contacts in Trieste, monasteries in the Alps. Each note was like a prayer for those who wished never to be found again. Some claimed he acted alone, driven by compassion for all souls regardless of their past. Others believed he was part of something larger, a network hidden beneath the church's wings, designed to preserve men the Allies wanted to destroy. When questioned years later, church officials insisted the bishop's work was humanitarian, that he helped everyone who came to him, not just those from Germany. But certain letters tell a different tale. The names written in his flowing hand belong to men later confirmed as members of the SS, the Gestapo, and other wartime offices, yet the bishop seemed blind to their history, or maybe he chose to be. In one surviving letter, he wrote, "Every sinner must be allowed a road to redemption." But redemption, for some, looked suspiciously like a ticket on a ship leaving Genoa under a false name. Even today, no one knows how many men passed through his hands. Some say dozens, others hundreds. His ledger disappeared soon after his death, taken or hidden deep within Vatican archives. The Church never confirmed its existence, but copies of his letters, now faded and fragile, still surface in archives across Europe, and every time one appears, it raises the same uneasy question. Was the bishop saving souls from damnation, or saving war criminals from justice? On a quiet hill overlooking Rome stands a monastery that once smelled of incense and old paper. Its windows catch the morning sun, and its bells echo softly over the rooftops. From the outside, it looks peaceful, untouched by the storms of war. But inside those walls, in the late 1940s, strange visitors arrived after sunset. They came speaking German, Croatian, Hungarian, and Italian. Their faces were pale, their clothes too fine for refugees. They prayed, confessed, and then vanished. The monastery was not alone. Across Rome, other religious houses took in foreigners who claimed to be displaced or lost. They slept in empty dormitories, attended Mass, and received letters from priests and diplomats. To the faithful, these were acts of charity. To investigators years later, they looked more like junctions in a secret network. One of the most watched places was a Croatian national college near the Vatican. It was officially a place of study and prayer for priests from Eastern Europe. But survivors remembered seeing men there who did not look like students. They arrived quietly, stayed a few nights, and left with papers in hand. The trail always led south, to Genoa, to ships, to freedom. Records show that Allied agents began to suspect these monasteries were more than sanctuaries. They were safe houses on the rat lines, the hidden paths that carried Nazi fugitives out of Europe. Inside their walls, war criminals could rest under the protection of faith. No one dared to search them. No soldier would raid a monastery. It was perfect cover. Priests offered confession and protection, claiming it was their duty to help any man seeking forgiveness, but the truth was not so pure. Some of these fugitives were members of the Croatian Ustaša regime, men responsible for brutal crimes during the war. They found friends in Rome who shared their language and politics. Letters passed from hand to hand, stamped with church seals, addressed to consulates in Argentina and Spain. Each letter was a step closer to escape. At night, the cloisters were filled with whispers. Maps spread across tables, new names rehearsed like prayers, ships and departure dates memorized. The monastery's gardens, where monks once walked in silence, became meeting grounds for ghosts wearing borrowed identities. Some priests believed they were helping souls start over. Others knew exactly who they were hiding. To them, the world's new enemies were not the fascists, but the communists rising in the East. They believed saving these men was saving Europe from another kind of evil. Decades later, when the archives began to open, investigators traced dozens of escapes back to that hill. The monastery never admitted to anything. It still stands today, its walls clean, its bells bright. Tourists walk past without knowing that behind those stones, history once held its breath. Were these holy places true sanctuaries, or were they crossroads where guilt bought redemption with silence? The marble floors no longer remember the footsteps, but the names they carried still echo through the corridors of time. Far across the Atlantic, the lights of Buenos Aires shimmered like a promise. For those escaping the ruins of Europe after the Second World War, Argentina was not just a destination. It was a new beginning, a land where the past could be rewritten, where names could change as easily as the seasons. By the late 1940s, ships from Genoa began to arrive regularly, carrying passengers whose papers had been stamped by Vatican offices, Red Cross agents, and sympathetic consulates. The Argentine government welcomed them with open arms. Officially, they were technicians, engineers, and doctors who would help rebuild the nation. Unofficially, many were former Nazis, collaborators, and war criminals hiding under the protection of false identities. President Juan Perón believed these men could strengthen his country. He admired their discipline, their skill, and their hatred of communism. To him, their pasts were less important than their potential. From Rome to Genoa, and from Genoa to the Rio de la Plata, a steady stream of ships carried Europe's ghosts. The most common route began in northern Italy. Fugitives would stay in safe houses near Rome, collecting forged baptismal records and new passports. With the help of certain priests and diplomats, they received travel papers identifying them as displaced persons. Once approved, they moved quietly to the port cities. Genoa became the gateway to the New World. Beneath the chaos of the docks, clerks stamped visas, officers looked the other way, and captains accepted bribes to ignore the truth. By 1947, entire networks existed to move these men in groups. The names on the manifests were ordinary: farmers, artisans, clerks, but behind those names were former officers of the SS, doctors from concentration camps, and administrators of occupation zones. Each one stepped aboard under a new name, leaving their guilt behind on the pier. In Buenos Aires, the newcomers found a country eager to forget Europe's crimes. Many settled into quiet lives, opening shops, working in factories, or joining military and industrial projects. Some rose to positions of influence, others simply disappeared into the crowd. For them, the journey had been a rebirth, but for their victims, it was a betrayal that reached across oceans. Letters from survivors began to arrive in Allied offices, describing sightings of familiar faces in South America. The reports were dismissed as rumours at first. Yet as more evidence surfaced, the pattern became clear. The triangle was real: Rome, Genoa, Buenos Aires, each point connected by ships, stamps, and silence. Argentina's open door became a sanctuary for the guilty, guarded by distance and politics. In Europe, investigators searched for proof. In South America, the fugitives built new lives under borrowed names. History tried to close the door, but the tide of men kept coming. Their papers may have been forged, but the escape was real. And as the sun set over the Rio de la Plata, the waves carried with them the faint echo of a secret whispered across 2 continents. The war had ended, but the hunt for justice had only just begun. In the crowded harbour of Genoa, a man moved through the shadows, careful not to meet the eyes of officials or dock workers. He was called Clement, though that was not his real name. His papers identified him as a Croatian technician, eager to rebuild Europe, yet every detail of his identity had been forged. Letters of protection, signed and stamped by unknown clerics, lay folded in his coat pocket. They carried quiet blessings, instructions for safe passage, and instructions for those who would see him only once, yet would never speak of him again. The ship he boarded that evening was large, creaking with the weight of goods, fuel, and the hundreds of passengers who, like him, were fleeing Europe. No one asked questions. The manifests were clean, names listed in neat rows, each signature validated by bureaucrats who trusted stamps more than people. Eyewitnesses remembered Clement for only a fleeting moment, a shadow among many. A waiter in a small trattoria in Trieste noted his accent, a strange mixture of German and Croatian. A priest at a chapel near the docks gave him a nod and a small envelope with instructions for the next leg of his journey. Those fragments of memory became vital clues decades later. From Genoa, Clement's path led south along the Italian coast. Letters had arranged temporary housing in monasteries and boarding houses, where foreigners murmured in multiple languages. The priests claimed they were offering sanctuary to displaced persons. In truth, they were guiding him along a route known to few. Each stop was brief, each record erased or folded into another ledger. By the time Allied intelligence began searching for him, Clement had already disappeared. His footsteps were faint, erased by the tide and the stamps on his papers. In Buenos Aires, a new name awaited him. A modest apartment, a job as an engineer, and a quiet life that no one questioned. Yet those who later pieced together the ratlines found the same names appearing over and over under different disguises. Clement was not alone. He was part of a network that stretched across continents, relying on clerical letters, travel documents, and the silence of those sworn to secrecy. Some priests believed they were saving souls, not shielding criminals. Others, perhaps, knew exactly who they were helping. Clement's story is a single thread in the vast tapestry of post-war escapes, but it illustrates how paper, faith, and geography became instruments of concealment. And even today, the trail raises the same question. Who blessed the letters? Who signed the documents? And who looked the other way while history carried away its fugitives? Clement stepped aboard that ship over 70 years ago, leaving behind a continent in ruins, and yet the ripple of his passage can still be traced in archives, whispered in testimonies, and felt in the shadows of the world he left behind. The story of a man called Clement is a story of corridors, stamps, and silence that the Vatican, the ports of Italy, and the Atlantic waves carried together into obscurity. Along the Ligurian coast, small trattorias, lit by oil lamps, hummed with conversation in a dozen languages. Among the travellers who drifted quietly from table to table, one man stood out, though no one knew his real name. He was a doctor, a man once notorious for his work in laboratories that now filled history books with horror. In Rome, he had been identified, his name marked for justice, yet here he moved like a phantom, his identity folded into the chaos of post-war Europe. Trattoria owners remembered him only for his quiet manners and precise speech. They did not ask who he had been. Papers carried his new alias, baptismal certificates, and Red Cross passes validating him as a refugee in need. The manifests from the ships leaving Genoa list hundreds of passengers, yet when investigators examined them later, certain names seemed to vanish, leaving only ghosts where proof should have been. He ate quickly, spoke little, and vanished before the next day. Priests who sheltered him offered water, bread, and silence. They called it mercy, but some historians now call it complicity. Along the coast, the route followed a pattern. Monasteries provided temporary lodging, small churches offered letters of recommendation, and the sea waited beyond the cliffs. Each step was a measured escape, as if the doctor were a chess piece moved carefully across a continent. Allies tried to track him. Intercepts of letters, reports from neighbours, and even eyewitness accounts pieced together fragments of his journey, yet he always remained one step ahead. The network of ratlines was designed that way. Every forged passport, every stamped envelope, every clerical blessing was a tool to erase him from history. When he finally boarded a ship bound for South America, the process was almost ceremonial. Names were recorded, tickets issued, cargo stacked, but in reality, the man's past stayed hidden in shadows beneath the ink. The waves of the Ligurian Sea carried more than water. They carried secrets, conspiracies, and fugitives whose guilt could not be measured in ink or stamps. In Buenos Aires, he adopted another name, built a modest home, and began work in hospitals as a physician under a new identity. The world knew him as a healer, a professional contributing to society, yet the ghosts of his past remained buried. These phantoms multiplied across the continent. Scientists, doctors, officers, and administrators all found ways to cross the ocean, protected by letters, envelopes, and the silence of those entrusted with their passage. The Doctor's story is one of many, a single line in a ledger of invisible men who walked among the living without acknowledgement of what they had done. And still, the Ligurian coast remembers. The trattorias, the monasteries, and the quiet chapels all hold fragments of that journey. Every whisper along the cliffs, every rustle of paper in an abandoned office, carries the memory of a doctor without a name, moving from Europe to the Americas under the watchful eyes of a church whose blessings were more than spiritual, they were passages to freedom. The sea keeps these secrets, and the manifests list ghosts. In the shadowed passes of the Alps, a man moved with caution, his uniform long gone, replaced by plain clothes that spoke of exile and secrecy. He was a colonel, trained in war and cunning, a figure wanted by armies and tribunals across Europe. Yet he was not alone. Guides led him through winding mountain trails, avoiding patrols, moving south toward Rome. Each night, monasteries offered shelter. Candles flickered over old stone floors, as priests whispered blessings and handed folded papers that would carry him across borders without question. Once in Rome, the pattern repeated. He was documented as a displaced officer, his history erased by letters of protection and the careful hand of clerics who claimed they were saving souls, not fugitives. From the eternal city, the path turned west, across the Atlantic, toward the towering peaks of the Andes. His route was unusual, bypassing Buenos Aires for the mountains of Bolivia. The city of La Paz became his new home, a place where the altitude could hide secrets and the government welcomed anti-communist refugees as allies. The colonel was assisted by what investigators later called Friends of the Cloth, priests and monks who provided guidance, introductions, and the documentation needed to secure a visa. His papers identified him as a European engineer, a teacher, a man with skills to contribute to society, yet behind the ink and stamps lay a life steeped in violence. In La Paz, he assumed a quiet existence, living among locals, teaching military strategy to eager students, and attending mass under a borrowed identity. His neighbours remembered him as disciplined and courteous, unaware of the past he carried across oceans and mountains. The trail he left behind was fragmented, glimpses caught in port registries, letters archived in Vatican offices, and whispers in safe houses where shadows of the night moved silently. Allied investigators never caught up with him, despite repeated efforts, because the network that moved him was careful, precise, and cloaked in faith. Each blessing from a priest, each note tucked into a ledger, each passport and visa issued by sympathetic hands allowed him to slip further from justice. The mountains became his shield, the church's protection became his guide, and the Atlantic became his bridge from one world to another. Years later, historians piecing together the ratlines found fragments of his journey scattered across Italy, Bolivia, and in archives too secret to examine fully. Letters bore the marks of Vatican ink. Entries in ledgers referenced his arrival, departure, and safe passage. Yet much of the story remained hidden, only reconstructed from testimony, whispers, and the faint imprint of someone who walked carefully between two worlds. The Colonel of La Paz illustrates that not all fugitives followed the same path. that Europe's shadows stretched far beyond Buenos Aires, and that the routes carved by faith, politics, and fear could carry a man from the Alps to the Andes without leaving a single trace of his crimes behind. In the rugged hills of the Balkans, the war had left ruins not only of cities, but of governments and loyalties. The Ustaše, the fascist organization that had ruled Croatia during the Second World War, found themselves suddenly stripped of power and protection. Their leaders scattered, their records destroyed, and their fates uncertain. Yet even in collapse, networks persisted. Priests, bishops, and intermediaries in Rome received messages, letters marked urgent, telegrams asking for guidance, assistance, and safe passage. The corridors through which these men moved were well known to a select few. Monasteries offered temporary sanctuary. Diplomatic contacts facilitated travel, arranging documents that could pass the scrutiny of Red Cross officials and consular authorities alike. In Rome, a certain address became legendary among those fleeing the Balkans. The telephone never stopped ringing. Voices in Croatian, German, and Italian spoke quickly, carefully, giving names, new identities, and instructions for the next step in the journey. The priests claimed they were offering aid to all displaced persons, but historians would later note a pattern. Those passing through were often functionaries of the Ustaše, officers with knowledge of atrocities and administration, and men the Allies sought for justice. Letters of recommendation carried the Vatican seal, and sometimes a blessing slipped into the margin, a few words of faith that masked the man's true history. From Rome, routes stretched to northern Italy, where ports like Genoa and Trieste became gateways. Ships carried them across the ocean, visas stamped in haste, identities forged in silence. Some went to Argentina, others to Paraguay and Bolivia. Each journey relied on careful coordination. Safe houses were prepared in advance. Hosts had instructions for arrivals, rooms with clean beds, meals ready, and the knowledge to ask no questions. The Ustaše corridor was more than geography. It was a network of trust, fear, and faith that spanned continents. Allied agents attempted to track the fugitives, but the voices on the telephone in Rome were always one step ahead. They never gave exact locations. They never revealed names that could be confirmed. Instead, they promised safety, passage, and a future where the past could be left behind. The corridors were not open to the public. Only those in the know could navigate them. Some priests believed they were providing mercy. Others understood the stakes, but chose silence. And the Ustaše, experts in evasion and deception, knew how to use both faith and fear to move undetected. When investigators later reconstructed the route, they found fragments, a letter here, a port registry there, a note scribbled in a monastery that matched others in Italy. They could trace the path, but the human details, the desperation, the prayers whispered in shadows, the quiet collaboration of clerics were gone. The Ustaše corridor reminds us that in the aftermath of war, escape was a science as much as an art, and that the voices on the telephone in Rome kept Europe's secrets moving faster than armies, faster than justice, and always out of reach. In Rome, there is a building that has seen more whispers than prayers. Officially, it is a place of confession, of sanctuary, of charity. But the documents, memoir fragments, and declassified cables gathered over decades suggest it was also something else. Survivors recall stepping inside to kneel at wooden pews, the smell of wax and incense heavy in the air. They spoke quietly, telling their sins, their fears, and in some cases, their identities. Priests listened, offering absolution and advice. Yet the advice sometimes went beyond the spiritual. Instructions were given on how to move, where to stay, and which documents to carry. Men wanted by the Allies left these confessions not cleansed of sin, but transformed into routes of escape. The same building appears repeatedly in the reports of diplomats and investigators. Letters refer to it as a point of contact, a place where names were registered and a new life could begin. Interviews with former clergy reveal hesitation. Some insist they acted only out of mercy. They say that anyone who came to them deserved care, no matter their past. But the memoirs of displaced persons suggest otherwise. The questions asked, the papers issued, the recommendations written, all point to a systematic use of sanctuary to protect those fleeing justice. The cables, declassified decades later, describe operations in which church offices coordinated with Red Cross officials, consulates, and private networks. Instructions were detailed, names, origins, and intended destinations recorded. The language is careful, coded in the way only insiders could interpret. Charity was flexible. Piety was the outward mask. Politics were the silent hand guiding which men received aid and which were left behind. The building became a clearinghouse as much as a confessional. Each confession carried a dual meaning, a spiritual layer and a logistical one. The men who passed through were not just seeking absolution. They were seeking a path to freedom, sanctioned or at least tolerated by those in power. For decades, historians debated the line between mercy and complicity. Was the church simply fulfilling its duty to offer sanctuary, or was it facilitating the escape of those who had committed atrocities? The evidence is subtle. The letters, the notes in margins, the coded phrases in old ledgers all suggest coordination, yet direct orders are scarce, yet the pattern is unmistakable. Across Europe, similar routes emerged, and the building in Rome appears repeatedly as a hub. The combination of ritual, secrecy, and authority created a space where paper could become a passport, where confession could become instruction, and where the word charity was stretched to accommodate men who should have faced trial. Walking past its doors today, one would see only quiet streets and stone walls. Yet the echoes of voices, the turning of pages, the silent movement of men whose names were erased from ledgers, linger still. The confessional was a place of moral guidance. The clearinghouse was a place of escape, and in that building, piety, politics, and human ingenuity collided to create a network whose full reach is still being measured. After the war, Europe was a continent in ruins. Cities lay in rubble, families were scattered, and millions of people were on the move. The Red Cross became a lifeline for the displaced, issuing travel documents, identification papers, and letters of safe passage. These were meant to help refugees find shelter, food, and a way to start over. But amid the chaos, the system had vulnerabilities. Clerical endorsements, blessings, and recommendations often accompanied the papers meant to confirm a person's identity or character. They were intended to help the innocent, yet in practice, they became loopholes. Men and women who had committed crimes against humanity could present themselves as ordinary citizens, and the documents carried them forward. Across Italy, offices of the Red Cross were overwhelmed. Lines stretched for hours. Clerks stamped forms as quickly as they could, rarely able to verify the details of every applicant. Priests, monks, and nuns, offering letters of introduction or recommendation, lent legitimacy to names that were otherwise unverifiable. For those fleeing justice, this was an opportunity. A letter from a Roman priest could transform a wanted officer into a technician, a teacher, or a displaced refugee. Each stamp, each signature, each folded sheet of paper became a ticket to survival. Ships waiting in Genoa and Trieste accepted passengers with Red Cross papers without deep scrutiny. Officers aboard the ships assumed that the organization had verified their passengers. They trusted the stamps, the endorsements, and the authority of faith. Decades later, investigators examined the records and found discrepancies. Names that had been recorded as displaced persons matched lists of wanted war criminals. Letters in archives carried endorsements from clerics whose role in these escapes had never been fully acknowledged. Were they naive, believing in the possibility of redemption? Or were they acting out of necessity, trying to manage the flood of refugees without turning anyone away? Some scholars suggest that design played a role, that those who understood the bureaucracy used it deliberately to protect certain men from prosecution. Whether through oversight, mercy, or calculation, the Red Cross stamps became keys in a complex network. Each mark on the paper allowed someone to pass through checkpoints, cross borders, and enter countries eager for labor, technicians, or simply people to rebuild after years of devastation. In Buenos Aires, Paraná, and Montevideo, these papers were accepted without question. A man whose name once appeared in Allied intelligence reports could now start a new life, legitimate on paper, yet hiding the weight of a violent past. The stamps, small and unassuming, carried the authority of an organization that symbolized care and neutrality. Yet, in the wrong hands, they became instruments of concealment. The Red Cross, celebrated for saving lives, inadvertently became a gateway for men who should have faced justice. The story of these documents reminds us that in times of chaos, the line between humanitarian aid and exploitation can blur. Beneath the ink and paper, beneath the stamps and signatures, lay the silent passage of history's fugitives, moving forward while the world struggled to catch up. Within the walls of the Vatican, decisions were made in quiet rooms that the world would never see. Pope Pius XII occupied the papal apartment, a space removed from streets, newsprint, and the chaos of post-war Europe. Yet, outside those walls, policy debates raged among cardinals, diplomats, and advisors. Neutrality was a guiding principle. The Vatican had long claimed it was above politics, a moral authority rather than a player in the shifting powers of the continent. But neutrality in practice meant difficult choices. Should they speak against the German occupiers and risk reprisals against clergy and citizens? Or should they remain silent, maintaining the fragile channels that could save lives in the chaos of war? Fear played a role. The Soviet Union advanced from the east, carrying with it a new ideology that threatened the Church's influence across Europe. Some clerics believed that maintaining connections with German officials and later helping certain individuals escape was a way to protect the Church itself. Letters were written, policies were debated, and instructions were sent to monasteries and consulates across Italy. Often, the word was simple: assist the displaced. But who counted as displaced? And who would be turned away? Decades later, historians piecing together archives find evidence of careful deliberation. Memoranda in Vatican files show arguments for silence, citing diplomacy, safety of the faithful, and the hope that discretion could prevent greater bloodshed. Yet other documents suggest awareness of the identities of the men being helped. Allies pressed for action, intelligence reports reached Rome, yet the Vatican maintained a deliberate quiet. Complicity was never written in official decrees. It lived instead in absence, in pauses, in the lack of letters sent to authorities who might have apprehended fugitives. The moral calculus was difficult. On one hand, priests and officials could claim they were acting to save lives, to offer mercy, and to protect the innocent caught in post-war turmoil. On the other hand, the men being assisted were often war criminals, perpetrators of atrocities whose passage to South America and elsewhere allowed them to avoid justice. Neutrality became a shield, diplomacy a cover, and fear a justification. Pius himself did not publicly endorse the escape of Nazi officers, yet the channels beneath Rome continued to operate, protected by silence and administrative blessing. Letters, passes, and recommendations flowed through the Vatican's corridors, leaving behind no record of explicit authorization. Scholars still debate whether silence was moral pragmatism, calculated protection of church interests, or deliberate complicity. It may have been all three at once, a tangle of fear, faith, and politics that allowed the same institution that preached forgiveness to also facilitate the evasion of justice. The silence of Pius XII remains one of the most controversial elements of post-war history. It is a silence that speaks louder than words, a quiet decision that shaped the paths of men across continents, and a reminder that moral choices are often obscured by layers of necessity, fear, and authority. In the end, the question lingers: where does careful neutrality end and complicity begin? In offices filled with maps, photographs, and stacks of reports, Allied intelligence officers tried to make sense of a continent still reeling from war. Lists of wanted men covered desks. Faces stared out from black and white photos, eyes captured in moments of ordinary life, yet their crimes were extraordinary. Arrest warrants were drafted, but enforcement proved complicated. The streets were chaotic, records destroyed, and bureaucracies fractured. Agents chased rumors, following threads that often led nowhere. Some suspects slipped through checkpoints because their names had been altered, papers forged, or routes carefully hidden by networks that reached from Rome to Genoa and beyond. As the Cold War crept into Europe, priorities shifted. Yesterday's killers became today's potential assets. Former officers with knowledge of Soviet strategies, technical expertise, or intelligence contacts were suddenly valuable. Lists that once meant capture and prosecution were reclassified. Men who should have been behind bars were interviewed, recruited, or quietly allowed to emigrate to South America. The fog of the early Cold War obscured moral clarity. Decisions made in the interest of security often collided with justice. An agent might recognize a man in a photograph and remember his crimes, yet be ordered to overlook him because the intelligence he could provide outweighed the pursuit of accountability. Across Europe, this pattern repeated. Allied officials, stretched thin and uncertain, relied on local authorities who were sometimes complicit, sometimes overwhelmed, and sometimes themselves beneficiaries of post-war chaos. Communication was inconsistent. Reports arrived late or were misfiled. Names disappeared in the shuffle. Meanwhile, the networks moving fugitives continued to operate, exploiting every gap, every miscommunication, and every moment of distraction. In Rome, letters and recommendations still flowed. In Italian ports, ships carried passengers with Red Cross papers and Vatican endorsements. The Allies noted some departures, but for every one documented escape, dozens more went unnoticed. It was a time when war had ended, but the machinery of accountability was slow to catch up. Intelligence officers, exhausted from years of conflict, were now racing against emerging geopolitical threats. Recruiting scientists, engineers, and strategists became a priority. Some of the very men responsible for atrocities were suddenly in demand, their expertise seen as a tool against a new enemy. In hindsight, these choices reveal a striking tension. Justice for past crimes clashed with perceived necessity for the future. Offices in London, Washington, and Berlin kept files on men who vanished, yet the files rarely translated into action. The blink of the Allies, whether through oversight, pragmatism, or deliberate calculation, allowed history to bend. Fugitives boarded ships, crossed oceans, and arrived in the Americas with papers in order, yet accountability lagged decades behind. The world was moving forward, but justice moved slowly, constrained by politics, fear, and the looming shadow of a new war. In the archives today, the photographs, manifests, and reports remain, a record of a time when the Allies blinked, and some of history's most dangerous men slipped through the cracks, carried by the currents of bureaucracy, strategy, and the chaotic aftermath of a world trying to rebuild. Stories of a shadowy organization called Odessa have circulated for decades, whispered in memoirs, newspaper articles, and investigative reports. The name evokes images of a monolithic cartel, a secret army of former Nazis coordinating every escape, every forged passport, every flight across the Atlantic. But the reality is more complicated. Instead of a single hydra controlling the exodus, historians uncover a bazaar of brokers, each operating with their own methods, motives, and networks. Some were secular, men who had survived the war and sought profit, influence, or simple survival. They understood the value of papers, ships, and contacts, and they sold access to anyone willing to pay or possess the right connections. Others were sacred: clerics, priests, and monks who, under the guise of charity and sanctuary, facilitated passage for men who could vanish from Europe quietly and efficiently. These networks overlapped, intersected, and sometimes competed. One broker might provide travel papers, another secure a berth on a ship, a third offer housing in a monastery or safe house. Together, they created the illusion of a single organization, yet in reality, it was an ecosystem. Investigators, reading through post-war archives, find letters between Rome and Genoa, telegrams from Vienna and Trieste, and manifests from ships that never carried the passengers their records suggested. Each fragment of evidence hints at coordination without a central command. Within this bazaar, efficiency was paramount. Time mattered. Allied searches were relentless, but the networks moved quickly, relying on coded language, trusted intermediaries, and the chaos of post-war Europe. Secular brokers might operate out of offices, offering papers for a fee or negotiating with local authorities. Sacred brokers used their positions in the church to provide credibility and protection, turning letters, blessings, and recommendations into permits that could cross borders without question. The result was a system that appeared unified, yet in practice was flexible, adaptive, and resilient. Odessa became more than a name. It became a symbol of escape, of the ability of determined men to vanish from one world and emerge in another. Myths grew around it. Authors imagined shadowy councils, secret codes, and elaborate hierarchies. Some memoirs exaggerated encounters, adding drama to the network's efficiency. Yet beneath the legend lies a clear truth. A combination of secular opportunists and clerical intermediaries created a structure capable of moving fugitives across continents. Some were motivated by money, others by mercy, and some by the tangled combination of faith, fear, and pragmatism. Whatever the reason, the networks worked. Men wanted for crimes walked freely into ports, boarded ships, and disappeared into new lives in Argentina, Paraguay, and beyond. The story of Odessa reminds us that history often dresses itself in myths to explain systems too complex to trace. It was not a single hydra with one head, but a bazaar of people, each playing a role in a network of escape that stretched across Europe and the oceans. And in the quiet corners of archives, in letters, manifests, and endorsements, the traces remain: a system of movement, a marketplace of exile, and a mask that hid the true faces of those who fled. The sun sets over Genoa, painting the harbour in shades of orange and purple. Ships bob gently against the piers, their hulls creaking as ropes strain against bollards. Stevedores move quickly, unloading cargo and loading crates, unaware of the secrets passing through alongside the goods. Envelopes thick with cash change hands quietly, tucked into pockets, passed under the table, or slipped into the folds of travel papers. Among the shadows, priests walk with purpose. They know the captains who never ask questions, the officers who accept documents without scrutiny, and the clerks who stamp passports without verifying a single detail. Passenger lists, meant to be records of journeys, are rewritten, corrected, and erased. A name appears one day and vanishes the next, replaced by another identity, another person with the same face, but a different story. Trieste, further northeast, hums with similar activity. The Adriatic waters reflect the glow of lamps along the docks, and the narrow streets leading to the port are filled with the quiet shuffle of men moving with purpose. Safe houses nearby hold men whose pasts are buried under layers of papers, letters, and endorsements. From the offices of shipping companies to the clerical desks of monasteries, instructions circulate. Ship manifests are adjusted, dates shifted, and cabins reserved for passengers who, on paper, do not exist. For those fleeing Europe, these ports are gateways to new lives. A Red Cross travel document stamped in Rome, a letter of introduction from a priest, or a recommendation from a bishop transforms a wanted officer into a displaced refugee, a technician, or a teacher. Captains and harbour masters rarely question the authenticity. Their trust in documents, in clerical authority, or perhaps in the promise of payment, allows the men to board ships and disappear into the night. The journey across the Mediterranean is quiet. Passengers sit in cabins, keeping to themselves, their identities hidden beneath papers and assurances. Crew members focus on routine, unaware or unwilling to probe too deeply into the lives of those aboard. By the time the ships reach South America, the identities carried on board have shifted completely. Men once known by notorious names arrive under the guise of common citizens, their pasts erased through paper, procedure, and silence. The ports themselves become characters in this story, silent witnesses to the movement of history's fugitives. Each departure is a moment of transition, a crossing not just of water, but of eras, identities, and futures. Investigators years later piece together fragments, scraps of manifests, letters tucked into archives, notes in the margins of clerical records, but the full picture remains elusive. Genoa and Trieste remain etched in memory as more than ports. They are gateways, checkpoints, and sanctuaries where the machinery of escape moved with precision. The combination of clerical guidance, cash, papers, and quiet knowledge created a system that allowed men to vanish from Europe without trace. The port of departures is where history's fugitives stepped from the shadows of a continent into the possibility of reinvention, carrying with them the silence, strategy, and secrecy that had guided every step of their journey. In the quiet chambers of Rome, letters were written with ink and careful hand. On their surface, they spoke of pastoral concern, aid to the needy, and spiritual care. To an ordinary observer, the words were benign, almost mundane. A priest signing a note on February 2nd, 1946, or a bishop endorsing a letter on June 5th, 1947, appeared to be performing the duties of mercy. But read in sequence, these letters reveal a pattern. Each phrase, each blessing, and each recommendation becomes part of a map, pointing toward Italian ports, ships, and ultimately South America. The language of mercy was a cipher. Displaced persons carrying these notes could present them to consulates, Red Cross offices, or port authorities. The words opened doors. Aid to the needy transformed into verification of identity. Pastoral concern became an implicit endorsement. A single letter might allow a man to travel from Milan to Genoa, then on to Buenos Aires, his past hidden behind a veil of clerical authority. Historians examining archives in the 21st century notice the subtlety. Margins of letters are annotated, dates carefully chosen, and phrasing repeated with consistency. It is almost as if a code had been established. Those who understood it could guide men across continents, unseen and unchecked. Some letters were deliberately vague, allowing for interpretation. Others were specific enough to serve as keys, confirming to a shipping clerk or immigration officer that the bearer was someone under the protection of the church. In monasteries and convents across northern and central Italy, similar letters appear. Handed from one cleric to another, they travel by messenger or by post. Each note carries authority, yet it also carries discretion. No one outside the network would suspect that the ordinary phrases of charity were guiding men whose names appear in intelligence reports or wanted lists. The system is elegant in its simplicity. A few words, repeated, recognized, and understood, can replace hours of documentation. They become both shield and passage. For men fleeing Europe, these letters are lifelines. For those investigating after the fact, they are breadcrumbs that hint at the scale and coordination of the operation. The phrase spiritual care is particularly telling. It is general enough to justify any assistance, yet in context it signals a pathway. A series of letters from Rome to Trieste, then from Trieste to Genoa, and onward to Buenos Aires, reads almost like a set of instructions, each step marked by the ink of faith. Beneath the tone of mercy lies a clear mechanism. Clerical authority, humanitarian language, and the trust of officials create a system that allows men to vanish from Europe and reappear thousands of miles away, their identities transformed, but their pasts intact. The letters are mundane, yet powerful. They demonstrate how language can serve as both protection and passage. When collected, they map the escape routes of men who should have faced justice. Each phrase, each signature, each carefully dated note is part of a silent, invisible network, a trail of spiritual care that guided fugitives across oceans and into new lives, all while cloaked in the veneer of mercy. Survivors remember the moment they saw their persecutors in new suits, walking streets that were supposed to be safe. Faces that once inspired fear, cruelty, and terror now appeared polished, ordinary, almost unrecognizable. A woman in Vienna in 1946 recalls seeing a man who had once commanded a unit of terror now seated in a cafe, drinking coffee as if nothing had happened. Across Europe, similar stories emerge. Men and women who had endured the war found their oppressors living quietly in towns, wearing new names, passing through borders with the help of documents and letters they could never have imagined. Investigators, following threads of rumour and whispers, travelled from archives in Rome to alleyways in Trieste, piecing together fragmented information. Each lead was a potential breakthrough, yet often it ended in frustration. Names would change, records would vanish, and a promising tip would dissolve into silence. The toll of each missed arrest weighed heavily on those who sought justice. Police reports, intelligence files, and personal accounts reveal the painstaking work required to track fugitives across continents. In Buenos Aires, agents worked with incomplete manifests, letters in unfamiliar languages, and contacts whose loyalty was uncertain. Each day without capture allowed a fugitive to disappear further into anonymity. Survivors carried these memories silently, confronting the paradox of recognition and helplessness. They had witnessed atrocities, yet when they identified the men responsible, the system failed them. The hunters were often constrained by bureaucracy, diplomacy, or limited resources. An agent might know a name and location but be unable to act because the proper authorities could not authorize detention. Sometimes, higher priorities, like the emerging threat of Soviet influence, shifted focus away from past crimes. Every delay created new layers of cover for those who fled. Altered birth dates, forged baptismal records, and clerical endorsements allowed men to live under false identities. Investigators relied on handwriting analysis, cross-referencing documents, and following patterns of movement through ports, monasteries, and consulates. Yet even the most thorough research often hit dead ends. Survivors' voices and investigators' reports intersect in tragic patterns. Each story of sighting, each encounter with a disguised oppressor, underlines the human cost of missed justice. The psychological weight of seeing a perpetrator walk freely while one's own life had been destroyed is difficult to measure. Beyond the records and manifests lies the lived reality of those affected. Families of victims carry the memory of absent justice. Communities struggle with the knowledge that accountability is delayed, diluted, or denied. The hunters, driven by conscience and duty, persist despite these obstacles. Their work is painstaking, meticulous, and often dangerous. Together, the stories of survivors and the efforts of investigators reveal a landscape of loss, determination, and moral complexity. Each missed arrest is a reminder of the fragility of justice, and each identification, however late, a testament to perseverance. Names matter. They carry history, responsibility, and truth. And when they are lost, obscured, or rewritten, The consequences echo across generations, leaving survivors, hunters, and the world to confront the cost of silence, delay, and deception. In the shadowed halls of the Vatican, questions linger that have no easy answer. Helping a soul leave a devastated Europe could be seen as an act of mercy, a gesture of compassion in the aftermath of unspeakable suffering. Yet when the souls in question carried the weight of atrocities, a moral tension arises that defies simplicity. Was providing a Red Cross passport, a letter of spiritual care, or guidance to a port an act of charity, or was it a way to launder guilt? Clerics writing endorsements in 1946 or 1947 faced a collision between doctrine and reality. The Church teaches repentance, confession, and absolution. Yet can absolution extend to crimes that scar nations, that cannot be undone, that haunt survivors decades later? Each signature on a letter carries the weight of intention and consequence. A bishop approving passage for a man who had overseen mass killings may have believed he was saving a soul, protecting a life, or following the higher call of mercy. But the same act, viewed through the eyes of survivors, investigators, and historians, reads differently. In convents and offices across Rome, priests debated quietly, sometimes out of sight, the ramifications of their assistance. Some argued that the work was purely spiritual, a safeguard for the vulnerable in a chaotic world. Others suspected that the convenience of helping certain men avoid capture eased the conscience of those who signed. The paradox is profound. Acts framed as pastoral care often intersected with political reality. A man fleeing with a letter from a priest might be guided by compassion, yet his passage also protected networks, concealed identities, and delayed justice. How does one reconcile the spiritual with the temporal, the forgiveness of sin with the accountability for crime? In archives, letters reveal careful phrasing, a language designed to blur intent. Words like aid to the needy and pastoral concern circulate repeatedly, a cloak of mercy that also functions as a shield. The line between guidance and complicity becomes thin. Scholars examine diaries, meeting notes, and telegrams from 1945 through 1948. They see debates over neutrality, over diplomacy, over fear of the advancing Soviet influence. Each decision carried layers of meaning. Clerics may have acted from fear, from prudence, from genuine compassion, or from a desire to preserve the Church's authority and moral standing. In hindsight, the accounting of sins is complex. Moral calculus is shadowed by historical context, by the impossibility of untangling intention from consequence. For the men who received passage, guilt is theirs to bear. For those who facilitated it, the question remains unresolved. Can a letter absolve? Can a blessing erase? Can mercy justify the movement of men whose crimes are beyond forgiveness? The answers are not recorded in archives. They linger in silence, in testimony, in the space between doctrine and action. And the Church, like the rest of the world, must confront the uneasy intersection of faith, morality, and history. Each act of aid, each signature, each passage to South America forces reflection on whether salvation can coexist with complicity, and whether mercy can survive the shadow of sins that cannot be absolved. In the quiet reading rooms of the Vatican archives, sunlight filters through tall windows, dust motes drifting in the air like time itself. Researchers in 1998 and later decades sit at long tables, fingers tracing the edges of leather-bound volumes. Some files open easily, revealing letters, manifests, and endorsements that had once guided fugitives across continents. Names, dates, and destinations emerge, threads of a hidden network laid bare for the first time. Yet even here, access is limited. Pages are blacked out, sections excised, and entire folders remain locked. Requests are denied for reasons that are sometimes explained and often left unexplained. Scholars receive notes stating that certain volumes are restricted for the protection of the faith, for privacy, or because the contents are considered too sensitive for release. The hinges of some cabinets seem almost to remember the secrets they hold. Years after the war, even popes are said to have been refused access to certain rooms. Inside, files contain copies of Red Cross passports, letters of spiritual care, and correspondences between priests, bishops, and consular officers. Reading them, one can reconstruct escape routes, identify clerical facilitators, and trace the flow of men from Europe to South America. But for every document that reveals a path, there is another that hides it. Black ink obscures key names, dates are erased, and entire pages are left blank. The missing pieces suggest more than carelessness. They hint at a deliberate pattern of concealment. Archivists guide scholars through corridors lined with shelves that stretch for kilometers, yet they whisper of chambers that remain untouched by outsiders. Keys are held by a small, trusted cadre, sworn to silence. Some researchers report finding files that seem to breathe, that reveal secrets only when approached with the right combination of patience, persistence, and permission. Others encounter folders that close like shutters, denying any glance into their contents. In these spaces, the history of escape, complicity, and mercy exists in a state of partial illumination. The documents that are available allow insight into how letters were written, ships chartered, and identities disguised. They reveal the scale of post-war networks and the involvement of both secular and sacred intermediaries. Yet the gaps leave questions unresolved. Every blacked-out page, every denied request, is a reminder that history is often curated by those who hold the records. The files that opened show one version of events, one pattern, one story of movement and aid. The files that remained locked suggest there is another layer, another narrative, hidden beneath layers of paper and ink. For historians, survivors, and investigators, the tension between what can be seen and what cannot is palpable. The archives themselves become characters in the story, silent witnesses to a past that is partly revealed and partly concealed. The contrast between access and denial, between exposure and secrecy, reminds us that the full truth of history may never be known. The files breathe, some willing to tell their stories, some holding back, keeping secrets that weigh on the present and echo through time. In quiet rooms lit by green-shaded lamps, investigators study the smallest details, searching for truth in what appears ordinary. Typefaces reveal dates and origins. The faint impression of a rubber stamp ink suggests authority, and watermarks on stationery hint at where a document was printed. Each tiny mark becomes a clue, a piece of a puzzle that can confirm a journey or unravel a carefully constructed story. Photographs of men boarding ships, faces obscured or angled away, provide glimpses of identity. Yet they also raise questions. Shadows in corners, backgrounds of harbours, and the tilt of a head tell stories that words alone cannot. A passport dated March 3rd, 1946, with a faint Vatican seal, suggests passage granted, but when compared to ship manifests, anomalies appear. Stamps overlap, names are repeated, and documents conflict in ways that hint at deliberate obfuscation. Investigators cross-reference these mundane artifacts with survivor testimonies and letters of spiritual care. Each cross-check can illuminate a path, turning rumour into timeline. Yet for every clarity achieved, another doubt emerges. An envelope from Genoa, postmarked June 1st, 1947, contains a letter signed by a cleric whose handwriting shifts mid-page. A photograph of the port shows a man whose identity remains uncertain, his shadow obscuring a badge or emblem. The forensic study of the mundane is painstaking. Ink fades, paper deteriorates, and rubber stamps leave impressions that are partially smudged or misaligned. Yet even these imperfections can be informative. They suggest haste, secrecy, or the movement of documents through multiple hands. Watermarks indicate the printer's location, sometimes miles from where the letter was signed. Typefaces can reveal printing presses used only in certain offices or regions, pointing to nodes in the network of escape. Shadows in photographs or in letters are almost as important as the words themselves. A slanting shadow across a portside dock can reveal the time of day, the direction of movement, or even the presence of a second person in a photograph meant to appear solitary. When combined, photographs, stamps, and shadows form a lattice of evidence, each strand supporting the reconstruction of a journey that was meant to remain hidden. But certainty is elusive. Tiny discrepancies can dissolve a timeline back into fog. A name that appears on one document is absent in another. A date conflicts with an eyewitness account. Even a clearly stamped Vatican endorsement may mask a cleric's true knowledge or intent. Forensic analysis demands patience, persistence, and a willingness to confront ambiguity. Investigators navigate layers of deception, partial truths, and deliberate concealment. Each document examined, each photograph scrutinized, each shadow measured, contributes to understanding a network that carried men across continents under the guise of mercy. Yet the mundane itself becomes a story, a record of movement, intention, and secrecy. Typefaces, stamps, and shadows are not just tools. They are witnesses, silent, impartial, and sometimes the only remaining evidence of paths that history has tried to erase. And in their details, the faintest light of truth begins to emerge. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Europe was a continent reshaped by devastation, uncertainty, and new alliances. The year was 1947, and the Cold War was beginning to sketch its dividing lines. Western intelligence services looked at former enemies not merely as criminals to be punished, but as potential assets in a world that had suddenly split in two. Eastern blocs, meanwhile, were casting long shadows over territories and governments, eager to expand influence, gather intelligence, and secure advantage. The Vatican, long a centre of spiritual authority, found itself in the middle of this emerging chessboard. Diplomatic corridors that had once been used to shepherd refugees now carried envoys, memos, and delicate negotiations between powers that were once mortal enemies. Moral questions that had seemed urgent in 1945, whether to shelter a fugitive, to provide a Red Cross document, to guide someone toward a port, were suddenly re-evaluated in the context of strategy. A priest who had written a letter of spiritual care in Vienna might find that the man it aided was now of interest to an intelligence service in Washington. The same paths that once protected escapees now offered the West opportunities to recruit scientists, engineers, and officers whose knowledge was valuable in the emerging nuclear age. Decisions once framed as acts of mercy were reinterpreted through the lens of power. The Vatican's role became more complex. Its diplomats maintained a facade of neutrality, yet quietly facilitated channels of communication that were essential for both sides. They balanced religious authority with political necessity, and in doing so, the moral calculus became intertwined with the currency of intelligence. A man who had been a fugitive yesterday could be a consultant tomorrow, and the price of safety, protection, or silence was measured not in absolution alone, but in strategic advantage. Western operatives noted patterns in South America, Italy, and Austria, identifying networks that had been active since the end of the war. They traced safe houses, letters, and routes, realizing that the Vatican had unwittingly or deliberately provided infrastructure that could be leveraged. In some cases, cooperation was pragmatic. In others, it was a continuation of choices made for reasons that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with conscience. Eastern intelligence agencies observed these same patterns with suspicion. The Cold War's early days transformed past moral ambiguities into active leverage, and yesterday's fugitives became today's bargaining chips. Historians looking back see the lines between good and evil blur, overlaid with maps, telegrams, and memos from 1948 and 1949. The Vatican archives contain letters and notes that hint at these entanglements, at the subtle ways diplomacy and morality collided. It was a time when survival, ideology, and conscience were in constant negotiation. The Cold War bargain was never written in clear terms. It was conducted in shadows, in whispers, and in the quiet approval or disapproval of men who had once been bound only by faith. The choices made in those years show how history, morality, and power can intersect, and how yesterday's questions can suddenly carry immense strategic weight. The world was learning that compromises of conscience could be traded, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly, for influence in a divided and tense new order. In the echoing nave of a cathedral, sunlight pours through stained glass, casting patterns on stone floors that have witnessed centuries of ritual, debate, and reflection. In the 21st century, voices within the Church speak of the past with a mix of apology, defense, and explanation. Clerics, historians, and officials acknowledge mistakes, yet they often distinguish between the actions of individuals and the stance of the institution. Apologies are offered for lives endangered or for aid given to those whose crimes were unspeakable. Yet these admissions are tempered by explanations that emphasize chaos, fear, and the pressures of post-war Europe. The argument surfaces repeatedly that individuals made choices in confusion, sometimes misled by incomplete information or driven by conscience, while the institution itself hesitated, calculating risks, preserving authority, and striving to maintain neutrality. Letters and speeches from 1995 through 2008 reveal attempts to reconcile faith with accountability, to weigh moral responsibility against institutional survival. Church leaders describe the corridors of Rome, the monasteries, and the archives as places where judgment was difficult, where clerics navigated a maze of competing loyalties and dangers. Some voices claim that pastoral care and mercy guided their actions, that spiritual guidance was intended to preserve souls, not to shield wrongdoing. Others confront the uncomfortable truth that providing passage, documents, or refuge inadvertently assisted those who had committed crimes against humanity. Historians note the tension between contrition and institutional self-preservation. Public statements often blend acknowledgement of past errors with caution not to overstate responsibility, creating a careful narrative that balances humility with defense. Apologies are sometimes directed at survivors, families, and communities who lost faith or suffered because of delayed justice. Defenses often hinge on context. Europe in 1945 was fractured, overwhelmed with refugees, and confronted by emerging Cold War tensions that reframed priorities overnight. The Church's role is thus portrayed as a complex interplay of morality, strategy, and survival. Yet, within the quiet chambers and research libraries, scholars uncover documents, memos, and testimonies that challenge sanitized narratives. They find letters that facilitated travel, communications that mapped escape routes, and records showing hesitations that amounted to inaction. The weight of these revelations resonates through contemporary discussions. Contrition is not uniform. Some clergy embrace full acknowledgement. Others stress individual error over institutional policy. Discussions center on the balance between conscience, obedience, and authority. In classrooms, seminaries, and lecture halls, students of history and theology debate these events, wrestling with the nuances of morality. The echoes in the nave are not just of prayer, but of inquiry, reflection, and reckoning. They remind the faithful and the curious alike that history carries lessons that extend beyond absolution. Morality, accountability, and institutional preservation are intertwined, often uneasily, and the process of grappling with past actions continues as new evidence emerges. The sunlight, through stained glass, illuminates both the beauty of faith and the shadows of its human guardians, reminding all who enter that understanding comes not from silence, but from facing the echoes left behind. Beneath the marble floors of Street Peters, shadows stretch long as night falls over Rome. The city is quiet, the streetlights casting pools of amber light on cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. We return here because the question has never truly left. Did channels tied to the Vatican help Nazi fugitives slip past Allied nets, or were these the unintended consequences of mercy in a fractured world? The documents in archives, the letters of spiritual care, the travel papers stamped with authority, all whisper fragments of an answer, yet none can tell the full story. History provides evidence, timelines, and patterns, but judgment is heavier than the sum of papers. Walking through these halls, one imagines the hands that carried letters, signed passports, and offered guidance. Were they motivated by faith, by fear, by politics, or by the quiet calculation of survival? It is impossible to separate intention from effect completely. We see photographs, manifests, and eyewitness accounts that map a network of escape. Monasteries in Italy, ports in Genoa and Trieste, and the distant harbours of Buenos Aires and Montevideo all tell a tale of movement, of lives redirected under the watch of those sworn to protect, to counsel, to shepherd. Yet alongside these records is absence, blacked out pages, missing files, denials of access, and archives that seem to remember too much. They remind us that some parts of history are intentionally hidden and that truth is rarely absolute. Moral questions rise from these absences like echoes. Was providing a passport, a letter, or a safe house an act of compassion or a betrayal of justice? Can the soul of a single priest or bishop be weighed against the suffering their actions may have facilitated? As the moon rises over the Vatican, its light touches the steps and the bronze doors, illuminating symbols that have stood for faith, authority, and continuity. Symbols that, in these years, were intertwined with secrets, compromises, and moral ambiguity. History offers verdicts in the form of evidence, patterns, and testimony, but it does not carry conscience. That burden belongs to those who reflect, to those who measure the weight of mercy against the scale of accountability. Scholars continue to pore over the archives. Journalists trace the shadows of documents, and descendants of survivors and perpetrators alike wrestle with the implications. Each document is a fragment, each story a whisper, and together they form a mosaic that is both illuminating and incomplete. Some verdicts can be rendered by history, yet others must be carried by the living. As we leave the marble floors behind, the question remains, sharpened but unresolved, a constant companion to those who seek truth. Judgment after midnight is not a sentence delivered by courts or archives, but a meditation on conscience, memory, and responsibility. We are left to weigh documents against conscience, patterns against intentions, mercy against justice. Some answers lie in the shadows, others in the clarity of records, and some only in the hearts of those who dare to look, to question, and to remember. The night presses on, and history waits silently for the reckoning that only we can perform.